right, so I'm in Hebrews chapter 6, and in this message I'll be going through verses 13 to 19. I'll be completing Hebrews chapter 6 in this message. In the previous message, I showed a bit of closure between Hebrews chapter 5, verse 12, and Hebrews chapter 6, verse 10. Let me review that just for a moment. Between Hebrews chapter 5, verse 12, it says, "For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God, and you have come to need milk and not solid food." So by this time you ought to be sharing with others what it is that you know about your God. And then in chapter 6, verse 10, it says, "For God is not unjust to forget your work and labor of love, which you have shown toward his name, in that you have ministered to the saints and do minister," which I believe is a reflection of teaching others. It's effectively the same thing. So by this time, you ought to be doing so, ministering to others in that respect, which doesn't have to be in a formal context. In fact, in many cases, it's much more effective to be done in an informal, personal, one-on-one kind of conversation. But that the Lord will definitely not forget this. All right, and then moving on into chapter 6, into verse 12, it says that you do not become sluggish, but imitate those who through faith and patience inherit the promises. Not in the sense of just try to be an imitation of someone else, but try to recall or remember or pay attention to those who are effectively sharing the Lord with other people, and do so as you are able to do so as well, and to keep that in mind. Okay, and to understand that there are great things that you can learn from those who are mature in the faith. All right, so that's kind of where I was at the end of the previous message. What we have here, moving on into verse 13, is we have an example of someone who we could imitate, or who we could pay attention to and learn a lot from. All right, and that is Abraham. So he goes into a small discussion about Abraham and what we can learn from Abraham with regards to his expressions of faith and patience, the promise that was made to him, right? And something to understand about these promises, that the promises that God made to individuals are individualistic promises. You know, the promises that he made to Abraham are not going to be the same promises that he makes to you. I mean, there are some fundamental things that he has promised that we can certainly hold on to. The gospel is the place to start, of course, that our God would dwell within us. And something very important about this is to remember that our God dwelling within us is a way of understanding that he is in our presence and we are in his presence. And so when we are sharing the Lord with somebody else, we're not teaching them or ministering them as some form of academic exercise or some form of debate that we hope that we win. You know, if we argue our point well enough, then they will just concede, because obviously we're better at the topic than they are, and then they're going to believe in God, and then everything's going to be just fine. And it just doesn't work that way. It's not just about sharing the truth that the Lord has revealed. It's also about encouraging people to have a personal relationship with him themselves, right? And part of a relationship means presence, that we are going to be in his presence, he is going to be in ours. You know, in any relationship, you're going to have certain components. There needs to be a degree of honesty if it's going to be a quality relationship. There needs to be communication. There needs to be presence. And we would expect there to be a certain degree of intimacy involved in any kind of relationship, however that might be described or defined. It's the same thing with our God, that he has certainly provided us with a lot of communication. He's said a lot. You know, go through the scriptures and you can see all over the place it says, "And God said." You know, and when we share with each other, about him. There is communication taking place, and there is an opportunity for him to confirm in the hearts of people those things that we are saying, or of course deny based on discernment. So there is opportunity for communication with our God in the midst of the communication that takes place with each other. But presence is a big deal. It really is. Just acknowledging and understanding presence. That we will have the presence of our God dwelling within us. And we will effectively be in his presence through that as well. All right, so we can look at an example of someone who inherited a set of promises, or who received of promises that were made to him, Abraham. And through the record that we have about Abraham and God, we can see a lot about communication, presence, and intimacy. There's a lot of that there. But in this passage, at the end of chapter 6, the idea of presence is kind of ended with the Lord Jesus entering into the presence of God in the tabernacle, the true tabernacle that is in heaven, as a forerunner. And this is important to keep in mind as I go through these passages, that he's going to go into the presence of God as a forerunner, which means that there are others who are going to be coming after him, and that is going to be us. All right. And so this is really important to keep in mind, because there's a lot more to it, a lot more that's going on here. Certainly we are in his presence and he is in ours, but there's additional, more, great things that are to come, and this is something to understand and to appreciate and to have hope in. All right. Now, where this started, we have to identify where this started, which is why the writer chose Abraham. Where this started is important in order to appreciate how this ends, with the Lord Jesus going into the true tabernacle in heaven. The Lord established a foundation to work with in order to describe these things, and for us to be able to appreciate these things and understand him more as a person. These things really started with Abraham. When God spoke to Abraham and he gave him a promise, he said, one day you will be a great nation. Right? And of course, that wasn't really for Abraham in the same way that it was for God. For Abraham, it was an expression of hope and purpose and meaning in his life. It's something that he wanted. He wanted to be a person who contributed to the world, who contributed for many generations. He wanted to be a person who would be remembered, and certainly we remember him to this day, to the extent that we are able with the information that we have at our disposal. All right, but his descendants are still going on today. They will never be exterminated, as much as people might consider that. But the reality is that we have a God who started with Abraham to fulfill a promise that he made to him, and God obtains a benefit from Abraham at a later date, hundreds of years later. Hundreds of years beyond the death of Abraham, God is going to be able to obtain a benefit, and it begins with him being in the presence of all the children of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, the children of Israel. All right, so that's where we're going to go with this. Let me start out in Hebrews chapter 6, verse 13, where it says, "For when God made a promise to Abraham, because he could swear by no one greater, he swore by himself, saying, surely blessing I will bless you, and multiplying I will multiply you. And so after he had patiently endured, he obtained the promise." Abraham patiently endured, and he obtained the promise. Now, there are some people who have suggested that Ishmael may have been an expression of impatience, perhaps. I don't think that we need to think of Ishmael in that way, that God had a son before the one that God would necessarily provide. He thought, well, maybe this was the way that he would provide it. It just simply had a lack of patience in a sense. But regardless of what Abraham did, there was never any real complaint from God per se about Abraham having a lack of patience. all right, and that he didn't endure long enough or properly. The day came and he had Isaac, and things proceeded from there. All right, so we have Abraham, and he says, surely I will bless you, multiplying as well as part of that. And then in verse 16, for men indeed swear by the greater, and an oath for confirmation is for them an end of all dispute. Thus God, determining to show more abundantly to the heirs of promise the immutability of his counsel, confirmed it by an oath, that by two immutable things, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we might have strong consolation who have fled for refuge to lay hold of the hope set before us. All right, just it's a way of saying that Abraham is an example that we can look to, and God was true to his word and fulfilled his promise. He is someone who can be trusted. And so the things that have been shared with us and have been communicated to us by others as part of the teaching, the ministering to the saints, those kinds of things, these things are true that God has revealed, and we can trust in these things. Just as God has been faithful in the past, he will be faithful now, and he will be faithful in the future. That there's no doubt about that whatsoever. And then in verse 19, this hope we have is an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, and which enters the presence behind the veil. All right, this hope that we have as an anchor of the soul, which is sure and steadfast. So we have what is the hope? The hope primarily is the hope that we will be in his presence. One day, when we physically die, that is a hope. It's a good hope. It's a legitimate hope, and based on all that God has done in the past and all that he has said in the past, we can trust in that hope. Jesus is the forerunner. He went up there before us, and one day we will be behind him. Now, this is a little bit different than what the Hebrews, the Jews, would have thought. This is quite a bit different from what they would have thought, from what they would be thinking, especially when you speak about going into the true tabernacle and in the presence of God, the holy place there. That's different from what God established with the nation of Israel when he established the nation of Israel. This is different. What the Jews understood was that, okay, you have the temple, and in the temple you have the holy place, and that's where God is going to be, and you just don't go there. All right? I mean, you just don't go there. You don't go into the presence of God. That's not part of our role, of the relationship we have. The high priest can do that once a year, and then that's it. But other than that, that's just simply not the case. And some people would prefer that. The idea of being in the presence of God is very uncomfortable. There's a common attitude that a lot of people have when it comes to having relationships with others who they would qualify as being unequal to them. All right, and I mean unequal in the sense that some people are considered to be greater than them, and other people are considered to be lesser than them. Right? Those people who they consider to be lesser than them, they may not really want them to be in their presence. Why would I want somebody who's lesser than me to be hanging out with me, consuming my time, invading my space? They're not really contributing to my life per se, to just be someone who I am nice to. Well, that's how good of them to contribute to my life in that way, that they give me someone to be nice to. All right, that's their form of service. I probably owe them so if I'm nice to them, now I'm indebted. Now I owe them because they provided me with that service. There are people like this. I know it might sound a little bit odd for many of you, but yes, there are people who have that kind of an attitude, and it's very destructive because, of course, you can never pay the debt. I mean, it's just beyond explanation with regards to just how destructive that is. And so, a lot of people, they don't like to have people who would be considered to be lesser than them around them, because this is a common kind of issue that shows up, and the risk and the consequences and the difficulties are just way too much of a cost. All right, but having other people who are greater than you is not necessarily going to make you feel very comfortable either, because we want to, we have a sense of self-importance. We want to be important and valuable and meaningful in other people's lives. Not all people, like I mentioned earlier, but we do want to be a person that is considered to be of value, of great value. And if we're in the presence of somebody else who has greater that value than us, then it could make us feel bad. All right? It can make us feel bad, feel small, feel insignificant, feel unimportant. It can really invade on our personal pride. And so just as a person will shove the people who are lesser than them from their perception out of their lives, so they will also shove those who are greater than them out of their lives because of their issues related to their personal pride. This happens a lot. And so when it comes to God, who is clearly much greater than us all, for a person to consider being in the presence of God can definitely be threatening. All right, it can be threatening to a person's individual pride. That they don't really want to be around God because they just don't want to feel bad. They don't want to look bad. They don't want to seem like they're relatively small. They would prefer to still have some sense of self-importance. All right, now, of course, for those of us who are mature in the faith, this is not an issue. We know full well that our God does not relate to us in the context of pride. It's just not what he's about. That's not what we're about. And there's a great appreciation for his greatness and an appreciation for our lack of it. And that we have a complete understanding that we certainly may not be able to engage to the magnitude that maybe he can engage with others or that we would like him to engage with us. But we enjoy what we have and we're able to make use of what we have. And we still find ways to live together and work together. And so after a while, the issue of his greatness is not such a big deal. And the idea of being in his presence does not feel as threatening. All right. And that's something to understand why, a lot of people, they just simply do not want to be in the presence of God. Now, the children of Israel were a great example of this. When God removed the children of Israel, who were the descendants of Abraham, who were selected for this purpose, to fulfill what he said here, because what he said here, we have a quote in Hebrews chapter 6, verse 14, saying, "Surely blessing I will bless you, and multiplying I will multiply you." Well, he did, and then the people who fulfilled this, they were at a certain time in history, they were slaves in Egypt, and God set them free, and he took them to a specific mountain in the desert in Saudi Arabia, and he spoke to them. And here was a wonderful opportunity, right? A wonderful opportunity for blessing and everything connected with it. God made this promise to Abraham that there would be these descendants. And hundreds of years later, there are these descendants, and now God gets to have them in his presence. And they get to be in his presence. He set them free from slavery, and there they were at the mountain of God. And God came down personally, and he spoke to these people. He did. Okay, we have a record of this in Exodus chapter 20. I'll go to Exodus chapter 20, verse 18. Let me check here. That's 25. Be back there in just a moment. Exodus chapter 20, verse 18 is a place where I'm going to start here. What had happened was that God came down and he started giving people the commandments that he wanted them to follow. This was his way of saying, look, this is going to be our relationship. This is how you're going to relate to me. This is how you're going to relate to each other. These are the rules, about how we're going to relate to one another. But what happened was that in verse 18, this is Exodus chapter 20, verse 18, it says, "Now all the people witnessed the thunderings, the lightning flashes, the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they trembled and stood afar off. He was doing what I like to call the God thing. The sound of a trumpet, mountains smoking, lightning, thundering, stuff like that. That's the God thing, how I express that. And the people trembled and they stood afar off. Right? Why? Here's our chance. They are in the presence of the God who saved them, and they decided that they didn't want to be that close to him. That's what was going on. Continuing into verse 19, then they said to Moses, "You speak with us, and we will hear, but let not God speak with us, lest we die." And Moses said to the people, "Do not fear, for God has come to test you, and that his fear may be before you, so that you may not sin." So the people stood afar off, but Moses drew near the thick darkness where God was. All right? God was there, and everybody else is stepping back, and Moses drew near to it. All right? That's a big difference. Out of all these people, and it was estimated about 2.5 million people were present there, only 1 out of 2.5 million, sometimes we would say 1 in a million, but this is 1 in 2.5 million, went forward and went into the presence of his God. And that's all that God got. He got one of those. That's what he got out of all those people. All right. Now, something I find kind of interesting is that if you take a look at what he had just said, the timing was quite interesting. In Exodus chapter 20, verse 2, he starts going through the commandments. He says, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You shall have no other gods before me." And I'm sure the people could think, okay, yeah, you're it. You are the God, and we will have no others besides you. He says, "Don't make any carved images or anything that has a likeness of me or that which is in heaven." I'm sure they could say, fine, no idols. We're okay with that. Don't take the name of the Lord your God in vain. I believe a better rendition of this would be to say, don't take his name upon yourself for no reason, for no effect, and for no purpose. If you're going to take his name, do so seriously. Remember the Sabbath day? Okay, fine. We work 6 days and then we take a day off. They could be good with that. Honor your father and mother. I'm sure that the father and mothers would be all in favor of that. Why be afraid of that one? No need to back away over that. Don't murder. Don't commit adultery. Sure, that's easy. Don't steal. Don't bear false witness. I'm sure everybody was just fine until he got to this one. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male servant, nor his female servant, nor his ox, nor his donkey, nor anything that is your neighbor's. Don't covet. Well, then that was it. That was it. Then they said, hey, we're going to back off this one. Which I'm sure they could think, well, I don't know, coveting is pretty tough. I'm not so sure we're going to be able to obey that one like we're supposed to. And then they back away. All right, so what happens? What happens at this point is that God had brought all these people to be in his presence. He could be in theirs, and they could start a new relationship with each other. And he makes it to the 10th commandment. He couldn't get to the 11th. He did tell Moses the rest of them, but he only made it to number 10 before they said, all right, that's enough. That's enough. We're going to back off on this one. And Moses steps forward and steps into it. That was a major moment. After all that God did, this is what he gets. After he made the promise to Abraham, and after hundreds of years it was fulfilled, and he's now got these people in his presence. They don't want to be in his presence. That certainly would be a moment for God. And so we keep reading, and God goes ahead and he tells Moses some more things that they needed to observe and do, and things that they should not do, and how they're going to do things. And then in Exodus chapter 25, he describes the making of a sanctuary, the making of the tabernacle. Right now, I do not know if this tabernacle would have been constructed even if the people would have stayed and embraced and listened to everything that he had to say. I would think not. I would think that if they would have embraced the Lord like they should have, and they didn't back away, if they did not reject him, I think anytime he had something to say, he could do the God thing and show up there in the mountain and let him know, and he could hear what they have to say as well, and they could talk with each other, and they could have a communication. They could have a public forum in that sense, just fine. But here in Exodus chapter 25, we have the construction of the tabernacle. And it could be a consequence of the people's rejection of God. Now, I'm not saying that it would not have been constructed anyway, but I'm just suggesting that, in my opinion, it could. It could very well have been a consequence of that. And what he says is, he says, we're going to make this, and this is going to be a copy of the real one. Right? Now, why didn't he just stay with the real one as well? Why not just stick with the real one and just tell the people, one day when we have an individual relationship, then we'll meet each other at the real one. But instead he says, no, let's just make a copy of it. We'll make a copy of it, and this will be among you. And that's what they did. They made this tabernacle, a big tent, and in this big tent, that's where God would be allowed to dwell, in a sense, or where he would dwell among the people. So they made this tabernacle, which was effectively 2 rooms, a holy place and a most holy place. And the most holy place was what we would call the back room, or what I like to call the back room. And that's where God was. God was in the tabernacle in the back room. And when did anybody ever get to see him? Well, we know that Moses got to see him. Moses spent a lot of time with him. But Moses died eventually. He was gone. And so that was short-lived, if I may use that expression. But God was back there in the back room, and the only time he ever saw anybody was when he saw the high priest show up once a year, and he wasn't there for very long. And there wasn't really much to say. Okay, that's the relationship that God ended up with between himself and the children of Israel in this abstract description. Right? And so they certainly were in his presence and he was in theirs, but there was an isolation. There was a form of isolation through the tabernacle and then later the temple that was constructed after that. All right, and so this is the setting. This is what we have, and then in verse 19 and 20, what we have is the description of Jesus being a forerunner that would go into the true tabernacle that is in heaven. And in the next couple of chapters, the writer is going to spend a lot more time talking about the significance of this. But here in this place, at the end of chapter 6, the importance that he's going to convey is the issue of being in the presence of God. And that Jesus will show up there first and will be in the presence of God. And that we later will have an opportunity to go there and also be in the presence of God. Right now, I described a little bit earlier how people can often feel a little uncomfortable about being in the presence of someone greater. And this is also reflected in the context of our God and his dwelling place, or what we may think of as the house of God or the temple of God. And we have constructed churches throughout history that have been built with this in mind, that there would be sort of the holiest or the holier locations within the sanctuaries, within the churches. And there are people who genuinely kind of enjoy these kinds of constructs, these kinds of buildings, because these buildings do provide the people with a certain degree of protection from being in the presence of God. And like I said, people can feel uncomfortable about being in the presence of God, and so these things can be quite appealing. You can get close, but you don't have to get too close, in other words. And so these buildings, these temples and churches that have been constructed over the course of time, a lot of people have used them in this way. They have used them as an intermediate place where they can feel comfortable, where they can feel safe, because they're almost in the presence of God, closer than where they would be if they weren't in the building, but not too close. Not too close. In fact, there are some churches and some buildings that are constructed in a way that they have special locations that only the priests can enter into, and that the regular people there in the pews, they just simply are not permitted to have access into these special locations. So I've seen some that are constructed out of bars. They practically look like cages, in effect. And so people like that. Not everybody, but there are people. There are groups of people who like that, and so there are buildings that can accommodate those kinds of people that are constructed in this way so that you don't have to get so close. But when we speak about being in the actual presence of God in the tabernacle, that's another thing, and that can be quite frightening. That can be concerning. That can be a little scary, But for those of us who are resting in the new covenant, and we understand that the sin issue came to an end, and we have already had an opportunity during our lives to, a little bit here and a little bit there, a little bit at a time over the course of time, we have built and developed some kind of an interactive relationship with Him through communication and presence and intimacy. It's not such a big deal. Instead, it's a form of excitement. It's a form of enthusiasm that we will one day be able to go into His presence in that way, to that kind of magnitude. All right? And that this is going to be good. This is going to be a good thing. So that's what we have here in the end of Hebrews chapter 6. Again, in verse 19, this hope we have as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, and which enters the presence behind the veil. That's an abstraction. It's a description of an abstraction, that we have this hope. And so with our hope, in a way, we are closer to Him, and that we go into His presence more through this hope. And that is definitely something to appreciate. But then in verse 20, where the forerunner has entered for us, even Jesus, having become high priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek, and I believe that should be translated as according to the order of the King of Righteousness, and that Him being the forerunner, one day we will follow, and we will be there also. We will be there also. All right, and so that's what is being presented here at the end of chapter 6. It's also an introduction to the tabernacle and the issues related to the tabernacle, and it's an introduction to the importance of understanding that we have a high priest of a different order, not a high priest according to the order of Levi, but a high priest according to the order of the King of Righteousness. And so that's what he's going to proceed into. And that we have that we have a tabernacle, and that is the one in the kingdom of heaven, and that this is the one that Jesus is the priest in and functions within, not within the copy. And that this is great, this is greater, and this is something for us to understand. Now, something to also keep in mind, that part of our inheritance in Christ and being a child of God is that we are also considered to be a priest of God as part of our inheritance, that we are a holy and a royal priesthood in this respect. And as such, we, as the children of God, have access to the true tabernacle, and we will have access to the true tabernacle, and we will go right into the presence of God right there. This is different from the Levitical priesthood, who were perceived as having this special privilege of being able to be in God's presence or closer to Him, and that they could be of service, that they could be a part of the activities that were taking place within the copy, within the tabernacle that was a copy of the true one. But of the true one, we will be participants as priests of God at a later date as well when we enter into his kingdom. All right, and so that's how I'm going to address the end of Hebrews chapter 6 with these things. And so I'll proceed with Hebrews chapter 7 in the next message. For those of you who are in small groups, I have a question that you guys can work with. What are your thoughts about being in the presence of God? What are your thoughts? As I've talked about it a little bit more, do you find it to be threatening or not threatening? Have you been fearful or not fearful? And not necessarily how you feel right now, but how you felt in the past. That this is an opportunity to share with the people who you are with and speak about your growth and your maturity and your understanding about the significance and the value and having an appreciation for being more and more in the presence of your God. And this can be very encouraging for each other. And so I'd like to encourage you to consider this question, and I will proceed into Hebrews chapter 7 in the next message. Thank you.